According to David Spencer, the term knitting describes the technique of constructing textile structures by forming a continuous length of yarn into columns of vertically intermeshed loops. Knitting has so many uses, like your socks you wear, or your gloves you wear, or sweatshirts, or scarves, or there's just so many things that knitting can be used for. The way you start knitting is you have to learn how to knit, and the first step to learning how to knit is you have to pick out your type of yarn. The yarn is all organized by different brands, colors, counts, and materials, which are synthetic or natural. And you can have a blended yarn, which it's made out of natural or synthetic materials, or like two different types of materials together. And then you also have to pick out your needle size. Your yarn always tells you on the package like what the color is for the dyeing pattern, what needle length, and they recommend how it should be washed, what the yarn's made out of. It tells you everything on the package, how long the yarn is that you're buying, so you know all that stuff. And usually you can find what you need in your pattern for when you find something that you want to make, unless you're making something just out of the top of your head, like a scarf or something. You don't always need a pattern for, but if you have a pattern, it'll tell you what size of needle you need and what type of yarn you need. So a yarn count is one of the ways you can pick out your different yarns, and according to David Spencer, a yarn count number indicates the linear density, yarn diameter, or fineness to which that particular yarn has been spun. So when they're making the yarn, it's either like really thick yarn, this isn't very thick yarn, or it's like how many times they've wrapped around the smaller particles of the yarn. So the first step in knitting would be casting on, and that's what you do at the bottom here to start out your knitting. And you can learn that from someone else, or you can Google it. You can do all sorts of things to learn how to cast on. But once you actually have casted on, you've created your first row of stitches. And then to actually knit, you have to start with it doesn't matter which hand you start on. It kind of depends on if you're right-handed or left-handed, but I'm right-handed. So I've already done quite a few stitches on this one. And you start out with the needle in your right hand, and there's a loop on the end of here, and you'll put the needle in the loop like so, and then you wrap your extra yarn that's going to your big ball of yarn across, like from the back of the first needle. So that's just from the back of the first needle all the way around, so you kind of have it wrapped around that needle. Then you pull this needle and go through this loop that's down here, and then pull it off the end of the needle. So you'll do that again and again. I can do it backwards, and you wrap it around, and then you go through, and it just becomes kind of like a pattern that you do over and over and over again, and then you end up with your stitches, which these ones are pretty close stitches. You can also, for when you're knitting, these are smaller needles, not super small needles, but somewhat smaller needles, and the needle size depends on how big of holes you have in between your stitches. So if you use needles like this big, you would have way bigger stitch marks, and that'll also be told to you in the pattern if they want bigger needles or smaller needles. It just depends on how big you want the holes to be in your hole, whatever you're making. So after you're done, and usually people count their stitches because the pattern will tell you how long it needs to be, so you have to keep 32 stitches the whole time or something like that. And then once you're done with your whole thing, then you'll cast off, which means you'll end it. And that's pretty much the same as casting on, but backwards. And once you're ending, then it'll be off of your needles. It'll be a scarf you can wear. It'll be gloves you've made, socks you've made, something like that. And then you just cast off, and then you're done with your knitting.